Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Monday, July 7th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine, suggesting yet again that you go to our website or go to commentary.org/roast to learn about this year's gala event, the 15th annual or 16th. I got to get the countdown. I got to actually do a count on my fingers of all the roasts. The annual Commentary Roast. Roasties prior to this year's have included Ben Shapiro, Barry Weiss, Mayor Soloveichik, Jonah Goldberg, Dick Cheney, so many others. This year we are roasting the hedge fund manager and all-around economic sage Clifford Asness. He will be our roastee. Very fun event. Huge enthusiasm for this event. Takes place October 19th in New York City. Go to commentary.org/roast to find out more, to meet the commentary. 500 of your fellow commentary-ites will be present and accounted for, including my panelists today. We have, of course, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Connetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
So I mentioned on Thursday that I was going to the Northwoods of Wisconsin for the 4th of July weekend, where one of my kids is a counselor and the other is a camper at a sleepaway camp, very much knit into the history of my family, as my in-laws met at this camp in the late, I think, 1950, and my wife went to this camp as to their siblings, and now my kids have been going to this camp now for many, many years, and it is near Eagle River, Wisconsin, the snowmobiling capital of the world, according to Eagle River, Wisconsin, where Paul Ryan, the one-time vice presidential nominee, told me, I believe he went on his honeymoon with his wife Jana to Bowers Dam, a local cold spot in the middle of winter, and took her snowmobiling on Lake Buckettabon, which is the lake on which my kids' camp is, and took her 100 miles an hour on the snowmobile across Lake Buckettabon. They came back in, and she said, we're never doing that again. And so that was the auspicious beginning of a really wonderful marriage on Lake Buckettabon, which is also the home of, as I said, my kids' camp. And I was at the first 4th of July parade in a small town that I've ever been to, even though I am 64 years old and should have done this long ago. And I just want to say one thing, because of our conversation last week about how 36% of Democrats say they're proud to be Americans, and what's going on with American patriotism and our education system and all of that. And let me just say that the people of Eagle River, Wisconsin, at the 4th of July parade, they are proud to be Americans. And they love this country, and they love the displays of patriotism that come from the local fire department, from the local marching band, from the local church, from the local all kinds of things just going down the middle of Wall Street, as it's called in Eagle River, Wisconsin. Everybody lined up to watch fire people on the top of these trucks, hosing down people with water guns, being shot at back by water guns from the street. Just high levity, good humor, and a real distinct spirit that, you know, when you live where we live and you do what we do, you forget what the feeling about America might be elsewhere, that is not home to the most cosmopolitan, intellectually sophisticated.
So I'm sensing a theme here, John. I'm going to just intervene.
Okay, please.
Past couple of weeks.
Yes.
Mamdani.
Yeah.
Your trip to rural Wisconsin. I think you need to consider getting out of New York City.
Listen,
I really do. Moving to real America somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you can still be near a small, mid-sized city or something. Go to Iowa, Indiana. I think it'd make you happier.
I'm going to say one thing about this that relates to Mamdani and relates in a larger way to one of the main issues on this podcast of our magazine, our institution over the 80 years of its existence.
Yeah.
Zionism. If I leave New York, just as a lot of Jews talk about leaving America, I got to stay here and I got to stay in America. Why? For aside from the fact that I'm an American and I love and I'm proud to be an American and I'm not going to have that taken away from me. Um, just as New York needs to be saved from Mamdani, and if every person who opposes Mamdaniism, if we all leave, we are ceding the city to Mamdaniism. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just demographically or whatever, except with the hope that a bad mayoralty will cause people to wake up and splash water in their face and get sane again. Similarly, for Jews in America, need to understand that part of the Zionist project requires American Jews to remain in America to act as a counterweight to Mamdaniism inside the United States, to continue to do what they can to support Israel through the American through their our existence as free citizens of the United States, wishing to express our will about what we think the world should be like and how it should function, without leaving the playing field to the rising world of the squad and all of that. So that's the argument, the sort of serious argument against not leaving New York, even though maybe I would enjoy it more,
Yeah.
is that you can't just walk away. Walking away has itself a deep political meaning,
Well,
which gets to Elon Musk for a second. We want to talk about
well,
Elon. Maybe we'll
I
do this
wanted to
in
talk about
reverse. Go ahead.
Mamdani. Didn't really
Okay.
think we'd start here, but
Yeah.
there's been a lot of news about
Yeah.
him over the past couple of
Yeah.
days, and I was wondering whether the poll showing that he's in the low 40s in the four-way race, or this amazing New York Times story that on his application to Columbia, where he was denied admission despite having his father be one of the more prominent professors at this university, Columbia University. Mamdani marked that both Black and Asian as his ethnicity, despite he's not Black. I mean, he's of Indian descent, born and raised for about the first 6 years of his life in Uganda. Has that changed your view that there is no possible way on earth that we can stop Mamdani from becoming the mayor?
The news stuff is pretty amazing, and a lot of it is just people going through his Twitter feed.
Oh, well, yeah. Plus,
Giving,
the whole
giving,
seize the
giving
means
the
of
finger,
production. Yeah,
giving the finger to the statue of Columbus. These mock videos he made about Christmas and Hanukkah. Saying he wants to seize the music. Speeches that he's giving, talking about how Rashida Tlaib is his hero. All that kind of stuff. That's not. It's not exactly like that's hard to find, and it's interesting that he didn't clear up his Twitter feed or clear up his social media the way people do to get controversial stuff out. He's clearly decided that he is going to embrace who he has been and run with that, because running away from it wouldn't work. I sort of agree that it wouldn't work. He's going warts and all, or maybe the warts aren't warts to people. The central problem, as you point out, is that there are four people in this race, and he comes in the race as the heavy favorite because he'll get 40% of those voters. Now, here's the interesting fact that people aren't talking about, because everyone's talking about, well, Eric Adams, the current mayor, disgraced mayor, who is running as independent. Well, we got to get behind him. People have got to get behind him to stop Mamdani. Or wait, Andrew Cuomo, the disgraced former governor who was humiliated by him in the primary, he's polling in the 30s, and we need to get behind Cuomo because Cuomo is, but maybe Cuomo's not. He doesn't want enough. There is sitting there the Republican candidate for mayor, Curtis Sliwa. Curtis Sliwa got 30% of the vote in New York City in 2021 as the mayoral candidate. He got over 300,000 votes. There will be a Republican on the line in November. If Curtis Sliwa drops out, there will still be a Republican on the line in November. If he runs and says, I'm not running, his name will still be on the Republican line. And several 100,000 people are going to vote for the Republican. Generically, this is a city of 8 million people. There are 4.5 million voters. 250 to 300,000 of them are going to vote for the Republican. That tells me that if you really seriously want to look at how to do this, you talk Adams and Cuomo out of the race, and you put all your chips on the institutional, not that it's very strong, institutional power of the Republican Party, because that's the only reliable anti-vote against the Democrats that there is in the city. And nobody is talking about that. And people look at Curtis and think he can't do it. He's kind of silly. He's got a lot of cats. He was famous 40 years ago. He's not really a major player. But his existence in the race means that Mamdani wins unless he wins. There is that logic. Do you?
I think that's a really interesting idea. And I also think, I mean, I think Curtis is a very interesting figure, actually. And he doesn't have, he's not, he was famous decades ago, but he's not stale. He's not sort of freshly stale the way Cuomo and Adams are.
He's retro.
But he's also got, if this is going to, if Mamdani is out there as something different and dynamic, Curtis has that in spades. I mean,
he's 70, so you have that. But of course, he's Cuomo pushing.
But
70.
So what's interesting is we're just going to begin the media's process of vetting Mamdani finally, which they should have done earlier. And I think he's an example of the future of politics when someone young and charismatic comes out of nowhere and delights the left-wing media because they seem so fresh and new. And then, of course, somebody looks at their social media feeds and looks at former rap videos he or she might have made and sort of cringes. But that's actually where I don't think we've heard the last of upsetting stories about Mamdani and what he believes. And he is leaning into it. This is actually the approach of this generation of young political leaders, is to say, shouldn't call him a leader, but politicians in waiting, they lean into their crazy because actually that gets them a lot of attention online. But Curtis Sliwa has an old school charisma that might actually serve as an interesting contrast to the Mamdani style.
But
what a weird race it will be.
What you are hearing from me is not being discussed in New York City. The people who are talking about, we're going to raise $1 billion to make sure Mamdani is a business community is horrified by the prospect of Mamdani. Jews are horrified by the prospect of Mamdani. But they're not, if they're meeting with Curtis Sliwa, I'm unaware of it. If they are thinking seriously about what I just talked about, I'm unaware of it. Because a lot of the people who are doing this are sort of advocating for it at the front of the lines aren't conventional political figures either. There are people, a lot of them were activated politically by October 7th. They're in business. What they want is for there to be a deus ex machina like Michael Bloomberg to float down from the sky, self-fund, be perfect, and take the guy out. And I'm saying that the practical logic says these three candidates are damaged. Cuomo is damaged, Adams is damaged, and Curtis Sliwa was damaged by sort of being an also-ran radio talk show host guy who patrolled the subways in the 1980s as a part of a sort of a
and a Republican and being a Republican.
Yeah, and being a Republican. So, but we're having this conversation about how to defeat somebody in one party and leaving out the other big party.
So my read on the couple polls that have come out in the past week is that even though Mamdani is the front runner, it's a tight race, and to your point, conceivably any one of the four could win, depending on the turnout. Who shows up, right, and then the extent of the opposition research and the ability of these three alternate candidates to define Mamdani in the coming months. Those are the two X factors, it seems to me. The turnout in the Democratic primary was high, but it wasn't overwhelming. I think about a third of registered Democrats in New York City went out to vote for Mamdani. It was an extremely hot day, so the seniors who might have been reluctant to pull the lever for him and more supportive of Cuomo, say, they didn't show up. And then you have this oppo that's been coming out, the resurfaced social media posts, the Columbia University story. Now he's young, so there's 33 years, or if you say adult since adulthood. That's 15 years. So it's kind of a defined universe where you can look at. But I have the sense that this is a man who might not be able to withstand scrutiny. When you look at his Meet the Press interview, for example, what came out of that? His whole thing that we shouldn't have billionaires. Now, most people don't vote based on their views of billionaires, but the whole idea that here is a man who wants to be mayor of New York and eliminate an entire class of people, which, by the way, is totally inconsonant with his radical Marxist ideology, I do think is alarming. And I also think that the bodega community is something that can be harnessed, maybe in a couple different directions. But they are clearly afraid now of this whole idea of public grocery stores, government-run grocery stores that Mamdani wants to implement in the city. And finally, Trump, of course, is going to play in this race. He's already starting. He attacked Mamdani at his Iowa rally at the beginning of the holiday weekend. He's talking about Mamdani on Twitter. I think Trump needs to go back to a Bronx bodega as he did last year. It was one of the highlights of the campaign in 2024. He also had a rally in the Bronx that was well attended. I think he needs to go back, and I think he can just say, look, everyone, stop this guy. I don't have to necessarily put my put my thumb on one of the other candidates, but we have to stop this guy. I think that would be an important message too.
So you're right. In other words, he is a target-rich candidate, Mamdani, as target-rich as any candidate that we have seen of this sort since David Duke. Remember, 1990, the Republican Party en masse. David Duke wins the Louisiana gubernatorial primary, is far and away, given the shifting politics of Louisiana at the time, a generic Republican candidate would have run away with that race. The entire institutional Republican Party turns on Duke, right? The President of the United States says, do not vote for the Republican. The Republican President of the United States said, do not vote for the Republican candidate for governor in Louisiana. He is a racist. He is a monster. And I withdraw the Republican umbrella from over his head. And Duke lost. One Democrat, as far as I can tell, has so far said he should not win, and that is John Fetterman. We've had Democrats say, I don't like the sound of this, and I don't like the feeling of that, and I'm a little troubled by this, and I'm a little troubled by that. And he is, in Democratic terms, not much different. Why? Because David Duke's a Nazi, so of course no one should be a Nazi. Well, no one should be a Stalinist either in the United States, or a supporter of a terrorist group that has murdered Americans in the last 2 years. But remember, he is a supporter of Hamas, and Hamas murdered Hersh Goldberg Poland, among others, in the tunnels under Gaza, as he was about to be rescued.
He's getting the Democratic rehabilitation process that every member of the squad also received. These Democrats tut-tutting right now will meet with him, be reassured by his statements, understand that he's running for all Democrats in New York, and that's how they will whitewash all of this. It's been done many times before. It's been done with people like Tlaib and AOC and all of the anti-Semitic nonsense coming out of the squad, and they've already started. I mean, Richie Torres, others have just been, sort of hinting here and there that they're open to, giving him this rehabilitation. So if they do that, then I think it's even more important, as you say, John, for at least one Democratic leader besides Fetterman to say something. Where's Chuck Schumer on this? I'm curious. Where's Kathy Hochul?
Chuck Schumer will never say a word about him because, of course, he has a re-election campaign next year.
Right, exactly.
He is primariable. The Republican playbook of the 2010s, which was, you really want to show your rising political power in the United States as a movement, take out somebody big, take out the majority whip, right? That was Eric Cantor. Guy took out Eric Cantor in a primary. Take out whoever. Go at your own party to show your power. Mamdani didn't have to do that in New York really because Adams didn't run for re-election as a Democrat, but he did a little bit with Cuomo, kind of. I mean, Cuomo became the stand-in for taking over the party from people. So you're going to see politicians like that absolutely refuse to do anything about it, and that speaks to, that is also something that is going to be useful to Republicans. So we didn't mean to start with Mamdani, but I do think that part of the problem here is that we got to do something crowd that I can think of isn't politically thick enough with experience and the experience of spending decades in the trenches of politics to know what to do with their money and with their energy, and they're going to the label, which is Eric Adams, and I think that's a mistake. Not that they can do what they want to with their money, which gets to Elon Musk, whom I didn't really expect to be talking to about that much, because I figured, okay, he's done, Doge is done, he's got to get back to Tesla. Tesla stock is tanking. He's got to do something about that. Nope. Comes out against the Trump budget bill and now announces the formation of a new political party. So he is, in many respects, following a model I thought we weren't ever going to see again. And I don't mean in terms of the really repugnant views that I'm now going to sort of talk about, but talk about the sort of mammoth business industrialist getting into politics of Henry Ford. So just as Henry Ford revolutionized the making of the automobile and created the 20th century, Elon Musk may be creating the 21st century with SpaceX and other things. And just as Henry Ford couldn't keep himself out of politics and discredited a lot of his own positions with his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and his, sort of his creation of this entire world of toxic anti-Semitism as a explanation for what's going wrong with America, Musk is now, being Trump's friend, now is becoming Trump's enemy, going to start a third party, the America Party, and do something.
I think there's a more contemporary precedent, and that's Ross Perot. When I look at the formation of the America Party on Twitter, or now X, I'm immediately reminded of the formation of the Reform Party on Larry King Live.
On CNN, that's
on
right.
CNN.
Yeah, in 1996.
95.
92.
Well, he ran in 92 as an independent, but I don't think he actually set up the Reform Party until after. But regardless, it's same idea of billionaire, not the industrialist, which is the Ford analogy, but someone who went into politics. What were Ross Perot's big issues? Anti-free trade and anti-deficit spending. So Musk has one of them. Musk, is, for all we know, is a free trader and has opposed a lot of the Trump protectionist agenda. But he's certainly against spending, or so he says. And so this America Party, announced again in this very public forum by an eccentric billionaire who's into politics, has a lot of the same resonance. Also, like Perot, there is a question of how this is actually going to be implemented. I would say Perot did more of the groundwork for his movement, because by '96, when he was also appeared on the ballot as a third party candidate, the Reform Party was an actual entity. And of course, in 2000, it was the Reform Party nomination where Donald Trump struggled with Pat Buchanan, only to lose to Pat Buchanan in 2000. We can see if the America Party will be able to launch as quickly and have such an interesting effect on American politics. But I would say that the recent track record of Musk in politics has been very poor. And he did make a bet on Trump's candidacy and went all out for Trump. And that bet paid off. Donald Trump won the election. We can argue about how important Musk was, but he did contribute a lot of funds. Ever since election night, Musk has not been doing well. He wanted Howard Lutnick to be the Treasury Secretary. Trump went with Scott Bessent. He argued against some of these tariffs. Of course, the Liberation Day agenda, with an asterisk, is still ongoing. Doge was created. I've argued that it is actually more successful a program than the media gives it credit for. On the other hand, it did not achieve anywhere near his stated goals, and he got into a fight with cabinet secretaries that he lost. And then he went into Wisconsin. He tried to win the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. He lost there. Finally, he tried to stop the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OB3, as I heard it called over the weekend, and I'm going to try to popularize, and he lost there too. So, if I were him, I would probably stick with his businesses, but he seems addicted to politics just as he's addicted to his social media platform.
But this is actually where Elon Musk's great strength as a human being, which is the fact that he is this polymath and he is easily distracted with one new idea after another, is a weakness in politics, but a strength in innovation and certainly in building his companies. But this America Party, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he's even filed to form a party, which there are actually bureaucratic logistical things you have to do. It's like that episode of The Office where Michael Scott comes in and says, I declare bankruptcy, because he thinks that's all it takes. So there's a sense in which there's a very performative aspect to Elon Musk, which I think draws a lot of support and fans online. I mean, he did one of his, wonderful trolling things back at Trump, like, what is Truth Social, when Trump did his whole anti-America party. Yeah. But will he stick to it? Follow through is Musk's weakness when it comes to politics, as Matt just correctly outlined. So whether he can actually form a party, he's certainly charismatic enough to draw people in who can help do it for him. But I don't see this having a huge amount of staying power.
I mean, ultimately, the central problem with the America Party is that third parties arise, or third party or like protest or revolt candidacies arise from a famous person putting themselves out there, and he can't run for president. He is not a native born American, cannot run for president. Now, he could run for governor somewhere. He could come to New York and run for mayor of New York. He can run for any other office, but constitutionally, he cannot be president of the United States. If you're going to create a national party, incept a national party out of nothing, there needs to be a person representing that party, right? Teddy Roosevelt was the Bull Moose Party. Ross Perot was whatever Ross Perot was in 92, and then the Reform Party in 96. George Wallace was the American Independent Party. When there was no George Wallace, there was no American Independent Party left anymore. The Libertarian Party has had a great problem because it never was able to attach itself or harness itself to a national figure who could use that party line to give that party the kind of nationwide heft that might.
RFK will get sick of running.
Well, no, I think that's an interesting point, but Musk has addressed it in his flurry of posts over the weekend. He commented that 2028 for him is way off in the distance, and he's not that interested in presidential politics for the America Party. He wants, it seems, to start at the congressional level. And he had this post where he's like, well, we need to concentrate our efforts on very close districts where we might be able to turn on a few thousand votes, House and Senate races, and begin to address the spending question there through the legislative process. I thought that was a very interesting post because it leaves room for Musk to have the America Party, in quotes, endorse the 2028 Republican candidate if that candidate is more amenable to the Musk agenda than Trump is. And,
go ahead.
I
was just going to say, can't he recruit all the fiscally responsible Republicans who are driven out of Congress by MAGA? Like, get those guys back in, and he can run them against them.
There is the rub. Because what you are describing is political nonsense in this sense. If he goes into if he wants to go into a race to promote X type of candidate in a congressional race or a senatorial race, the structure of American politics would say that whoever that candidate is parasitic or vampiric, meaning will not bring new voters into a 2026 congressional race out of nowhere.
Spoiler. Yeah.
What they'll do is take votes away from one or the other party, meaning take votes away from the Republican Party since he wants to run on deficit hawkishness, and thereby elect Democrats and help Democrat if this were to happen.
That's what the Libertarian Party does. Of course,
right.
the Green Party takes votes away from Democrats. And
right.
This is my my question, or kind of why I'm amused by it, the American Party, which is I have no idea what it stands for. I have no idea what it stands for. It just stands for opposition to this piece of legislation, which was signed into law 72 hours ago. And why were we opposed to it? As I've been saying all along, it was unclear. What was Elon Musk's critique of the One Big Beautiful Bill? Was spent too much money. Okay, well, where was his alternative? Did he want harsher Medicaid cuts? Did he want to address Social Security and Medicare as part of this? We know he also is very upset about the clawback of the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called green energy spending. So we're against spending, except if it subsidizes these alternate energies that Jimmy Carter started 40, 50 years ago now. It just doesn't make any sense. And that's just the spending side. Where does the American Party stand on taxes?
Okay,
should taxes go up or should they go down? Where is it on social issues? You can see conceivably a Democrat, as some of the professional class Democrats, liberal gentry type Democrats now, well, if they're upset about spending, maybe they want to run on the America Party line.
We had talked just before we got on there. We talked about whether we were going to talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill, and we said, "Nah." We talked about it enough on Thursday, but I've been thinking a lot about it over the weekend, and about the sort of almost universal. It's a tar baby, right? Like Trump is the only person who is like, "This is the greatest thing ever."
And
Everyone's like, "I had to vote for it," but the Republicans who voted for it aren't like dancing in this. They're careful. They're like, "We had to. There were things in it we don't like, but we did it anyway, and we had seen it gave Trump a political victory." You've been talking about it as a political. Okay, so the thing is that Democrats hate it. All Democrats hate it and are opposed to it, and there are 10 different reasons. They don't like the Medicare provisions, particularly. They don't like this. They don't like that. They don't like the other thing. It's going to kill people. All of that. And then there are Republicans who are like, it spends too much, it spends too much, it spends too much. We didn't cut. We needed to cut more. This bill has one mega purpose. That is why it passed and why it had to pass, which is that the tax cuts of 2017 had to be made permanent. And what you need to think about if you are thinking about this bill and talking to people about it is not why it's bad that it exists, but what the world would look like if it didn't, or if this major element of it, the major element of it, which is the perpetuation of the permanence of the 2017 tax cuts, would not have happened this year. You want to talk about an inflationary effect? You want to talk about an economic earthquake? You want to talk about resetting people's every financial, long-term financial decision that people from the lower middle classes to the very rich have been making under the provisions of the 2017 tax cuts would have to be revisited en masse really quickly to figure out what's going on. Immense uncertainty about the effects, all of that. So there is no credit being given because it's politically advantageous to almost everybody to sort of, spit on it and say it's garbage. But in the end, its passage was absolutely necessary, not only for the Republican political future, but to create a stable American platform from which to grow the economy from here on out, because growth is the only way we're going to get out of this spending problem that we have, that clearly politicians are not going to address. They're not going to address entitlements. They're not going to address the real needs of defense spending. And we need an explosion of economic growth one way or the other in order to have money flowing into the federal government to start tackling some of this or reducing the threat of the fiscal cliff in the long run. And no one's talking about that. And I would like to be a purist and talk about how wonderful, it would be if it were more fiscally prudent and responsible, the bill. But that's not what the bill is about, really. That's the truth.
Right. It forestalls the worst. It also has a debt ceiling increase in it, so that takes that issue off the table for a while yet, at least. But I agree. The bill was necessary. I think maybe I'm a little bit more skeptical of the pro growth elements in the bill because it doesn't actually cut income tax rates.
Right.
It maintains the current level,
Right.
and then it has these carve outs for populist purposes, which are not necessarily pro
No
growth.
taxes on tips.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Oh
over
no,
time,
I'm only saying you have to compare the growth aspects of maintaining the tax cuts with the anti-growth aspects of the tax
well,
cuts.
that one is the most ridiculous arguments I read over the weekend, which I believe it was the Washington Post had a front page story about. One reason this tax bill is so bad is that the labor market looks a little bit rocky. So, what? We're supposed to raise taxes if the economy looks weak? What kind of economic nonsense is that? It's why I think you're right. The liberals and Democrats haven't grappled with the enormity of the tax cliff that we were facing at the end of the year, and they would prefer not to have to grapple with it. That's the way they are, and it's always hard in politics, I should add, to prove a negative. So I don't think you're going to see Republicans go onto the campaign trail next year and say, we passed this bill and it's great because we prevented a tax increase.
No, of course.
They may use that to attack Democrats, but what they're going to have to say is some of the other things. I think no tax on tips. I think a lot of the emphasis will be on the immigration aspects of the bill. So it's this, it's not a Rorschach test. It's kind of like this blob that you kind of just try to grapple with, and certain aspects pop up, and then then there are other aspects that you don't want to like. You try to stamp down.
But they will have to answer for the Medicaid stuff, and that's going to be really hard as rural hospitals shut down, and there are all these other things not entirely caused by what was passed in this bill, but that is going to be the Democratic message. They're already honing it, and that's actually also difficult for Republicans to respond to because it involves getting into the weeds, as we did last week on the podcast, about what's being cut, what's being reversed that was brought in under Biden. And it gets very technical very quickly. And people just see old people not getting health care. And they say, this is terrible. Republicans want this.
But I just quickly, that's why the mega, or the sort of, what am I thinking here? The macro qualities of the bill are what matter. I'm not saying it's a growth bill, but I'm saying it's now Trump's economy. He got his bill. 2026 will be, do you feel good about the economy? Do you not feel good about the economy? No one's going to vote on a rural hospital closing. I mean, they'll vote on a rural hospital closing if they feel crappy about other stuff. And then they're like, and all these rural hospitals are closing. If they feel better off, they're going to vote like people who feel better off and give credit to the people who have been claiming that they were going to make things better, not the people who said that things were going to get worse. Abe?
I do think this is the case. We've talked a lot about, especially during the Biden years, about how if you are feeling the economic hit, if you are taking a hit personally, you cannot be talked into the idea that the economy is good and everything's great and everyone feels wonderful. I don't think it works quite in the reverse. I think if you're okay, you can be talked into the idea that there's deprivation out there now because of what has happened. You may not be feeling it, but it's happening and it's bad out there. It's more effective than the non-starter.
But even that is about the general atmosphere.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we went through this with Biden.
Yeah.
Because Biden was always saying and complaining, well, you just don't understand all the great things that I passed for you. And why is this district or state going for Trump when I had all these infrastructure projects as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law? And I've had all these green energy projects because of the Inflation Reduction Act. It doesn't work that way. Politics is driven by these general sentiments and attitudes, yes, about the state of the country, but also more particularly about the state of individual candidates. So I continue to be skeptical that somehow the future of the Republican majority, at risk for sure, is tied to this one bill. And maybe this is a segue to another topic we need to address today. You see a kind of preview of coming attractions in the ghoulish attempt by liberals and some Democrats in order to blame this awful, horrifying tragedy in Central Texas on Trump budget cuts, right? The floods that happened over the weekend on the Guadalupe River, killing up above 80 people now, many of them children, dozens of children who were attending summer camp during this once in a century, once in 2 centuries flood, when you think about how much rain fell in such a short amount of time. On social media, almost immediately, people were saying that the reason that the warnings did not get to the affected parties on time was because of personnel shortages, thanks to Doge and Trump, or thanks to cuts to the National Weather Service that Republicans have wanted to impose. These are myths. They circulated on social media. But here, too, I think that people are getting better at confronting these charges as soon as they happen in real time. And if this happens down the road where someone says, well, look at this family, they've lost their Medicaid coverage and it's all because of the one beautiful bill. Yes, that will convince people, partisans who are already convinced that Trump is the source of all evil in the universe. But I think that the how far it plays won't be as what these partisans expect.
The tragedy in Texas really is, has happened before. We're now finding these sorts of flash floods have happened before in this area, but it's Kirk County where most of the, certainly where the kids' camp was and where a lot of the casualties were. Kirk County has over time recognized it needs to have some sort of alarm system for rapidly rising water, and locals have voted against it because it costs money. And so there is actually this strange sort of federalism argument about I think the people blaming Trump are, as Matt says, incredibly ghoulish and wrongheaded. But the argument of whether the federal government should be involved at every local level rather than this county, which said, they know they need it. They know it would be useful because cell phone signals that do give those flood warnings, which I get on my cell phone, lots of people do, they don't reach into those more rural areas. They need an alert system. They haven't agreed. The people in that community have not agreed to raise the money through tax increases or however they're going to do it, property tax increases, to install one. Now maybe they will, but this debate has come up locally many, many times over the past few decades. So but I do think the political usefulness to people on the left of this particular moment does show a real degradation in our politics, rather than understanding, first of all, natural disasters do happen. The Weather Service was issuing warnings. There doesn't seem to have been a breakdown. Freak weather events do startle and surprise even the most sophisticated forecasters. And it's a horrible tragedy for which no one is to blame. These things, right. There was the famous, during Mark Twain's time, the famous newspaper headline when a ferry boat caught on fire and burned and was like hundreds died, no one to blame. We're out of the habit of understanding tragedy in that way. But I do think the real question is, going forward, how should these local communities distribute their resources to prevent this in the future if possible?
2 things about that. One, Matt, as you say, people are getting better at combating it. All it took was going through the living memory of people who live along the Guadalupe River to remember that a Christian camp in 1987 was overrun and 10 kids drowned, camp like right on the banks of the river, and there was a flood and 10 kids drowned. That's not hundreds of people drowning, as was the case here. But the case here was a 30-foot wall of water where water was rising at the rate of a foot an hour until it hit this, sort of this, it's like a tsunami in fresh water. And yeah, you can then do one of these classic environmentalist, regressions where it's like, this happened and this happened and this happened. And you see it's all because of global warming. So the latest thing is, this is the result of the aftermath of a worse storm that created the conditions under which the rivers rose and this happened, and so we need to regress back to why this storm happened, and obviously global warming is climate
This
change
is
is
a
the
great
reason.
illustration of ideological thinking that predominates the left. That every event has to be kind of retrofitted into some larger ideological framework, and whether it is the partisan progressive framework that everything that goes wrong is somehow reducible to the Republican agenda of lower taxes and less government spending, or this much broader global progressive framework that everything that bad that happens in the natural world is based on global warming or climate change.
Right.
It's the ideological mind at work. Whereas I think a conservative approach is exactly as Christine says: is we'll look at the circumstances, look at also the fact that tragedy and nature is red in tooth and claw, and these awful and things happen sometimes. And yes, what's going on with the locality? What's going on with human error? Because these warnings were coming in. It was at night. People were sleeping. How do you get? I mean, it's a tragedy from start to finish. And that's why I get so incensed when I see these people making these arguments on Twitter, trying to score partisan points, including the aforementioned Chuck Schumer, who can he just retire? Just retire today, Chuck. You're useless. You're worse. You're worse than useless
He's
now.
going to Sun Valley. He's on his way to Sun Valley to tell us all how to behave.
He should just announce the retirement. And plus, that AOC's entry into that race would get attention away from Mamdani, maybe make it easier to beat him.
Okay, so our Jim Meggs, our tech commentary columnist in Commentary Magazine, has been writing since he started writing his column, I think 7 or 8 years ago, repeatedly about how America deals with disasters. And there is a problem. There are two associated problems that he dictates, one of which is that ordinary people do not respond to threats of danger, or they are skeptical of threats of danger because they live on the planet Earth and they don't expect someone says, oh, you better flee now, something's coming. And they're like, well, where am I supposed to go? And I don't have the money to rent a hotel room somewhere. And what's more, it's going to cost me. I'll take my chances. And maybe that's unwise, although 90% of the time it's probably wise. And then there is what happens when the disaster happens, when if you leave people to their own devices, they will organize, they will save themselves, they will save their communities, and looking for top-down help is often
and there are
incredibly counterproductive.
There are remarkable examples of heroism in the rescue effort that's been going on now for several days in Central Texas.
I mean, it's not that overcomes the horrifying, tragic aspects of this, but human nature has these two qualities, one of which is, I haven't seen this before, I'm not going to pick up stakes and like drive off somewhere until somebody gives me the all clear. That's going to be unbelievably disruptive to my life and my finances. And then the black swan event happens, and there's 30 feet of water, and there's nothing that you can do about it.
But this is important because it ties both what you're saying and what Matt just said together in something that's even beyond partisan politics, and that's worldview. Because the sort of left-leaning worldview traffics in abstractions and looks to abstractions to explain freak events. The conservative worldview accepts that unexpected things will happen. It doesn't mean that they tolerate it or even encourage it, but then it's the question of how do we solve this practical problem based on our real world experience, and that does
our understanding of human nature.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So in 1992, one of the worst natural disasters in American history, which was Hurricane Andrew, right, destroyed a lot of southern Florida. And practically speaking, by the way, Florida was a purple state, had a Democratic governor at the time. I think it had a Democratic legislature at the time. So these were, more regulatory people with a more regulatory framework than otherwise. But the disaster happened. Everybody looked and they said, our building codes here in southern Florida cannot withstand the natural events that can occur here on a regular basis because of where we sit in Hurricane Alley or whatever. And the state, in an extraordinarily nonpartisan fashion, doing something that Republicans generally don't do, but Republicans agreed to. And then there was a Republican governor who, like, there were Republican governors who continued this effort, including Jeb Bush, that they reformed the building code system, created new regulations in a good way, good regulations.
Well,
all regulations are not
California bad. After the Frisco quake in the 80s and then the Northridge quake in the early 90s, same thing.
Yeah. So it's not like we don't see a way in which there are practical ways to deal with crises, particularly after they happen, because when you say we have to do X, Y, and Z in order to prevent a crisis, you never know that the crisis would actually take place. And telling people, we need to spend $40 billion rebuilding the Bay Bridge so that the Bay Bridge can survive an earthquake. Like, until an earthquake destroys the Bay Bridge, no one on earth is going to want to spend that money on that bridge so that it can sway, if the tectonic plates move. Like, no, that's not going to happen. So there is this kind of utopianism about repairing problems where it's just not the way human nature is. And then the hope that you can affix blame for something to another political party or to your political opponents or something like that is frankly morally repellent. Is morally repellent to say this 30-foot wall of water that no early warning system could have detected, by the way, just could have said, you better get out of the way, there's a flood coming.
But I can't think of a single natural disaster since over the past decade at least that hasn't been immediately politicized in this way.
Right.
Hasn't
Sandy,
been.
That's our tribalism. But I will say I do draw a distinction between kind of backward looking, kind of retrospective bias, hindsight bias, and criticisms of how government is responding once a disaster occurs. And so I do think in the case of Sandy, in the case of Hurricane Helene just last year, the converse is true of, say, recent hurricanes in Florida, where the government response has been incredible. Katrina in 2005, that is a more ambiguous case, as our friend Yuval Levin likes to explain at length when he's asked. Nonetheless, there are places where how is FEMA responding? How are different levels of government responding to tragedy? I will say this. So far, it seems to me, our government, the Texas government, and the local government is responding very well in trying to rescue everyone that's still alive and recovering those who are no longer alive. And there might be time down the road where people want to say, well, did FEMA do this? Did FEMA not do this? But that's how I would kind of draw the distinction. And that might take us to the federal government, and President Trump and his meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu this evening, which is the last thing we ought to talk about.
Okay. So over the weekend, Trump is meeting Netanyahu. Obviously, the meeting was set with the idea that at the end of it or during it or something like that, it's possible that a big announcement could be made, either about a ceasefire with Hamas, a hostage deal with Hamas, or some kind of roadmap to the conclusion of the war in Gaza. And there's been a lot of news over the last week about how the things are going, and there's the Israeli delegation in Doha on one floor of a hotel, and the Hamas delegation is on another floor of the hotel, and someone's taking the elevator up and down. It's like running between the floors with the latest proposal or counterproposal, since they won't sit at the table together. I am more interested in the fact that this is all happening after some weird acknowledgments of certain things that are happening in Israel, in Gaza, that indicate that, except for Israelis, this and sort of lunatics on campuses and the people who are making money off activism here, that that the war in Gaza is effectively over. Two details. One is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has distributed 60 million meals since it started doing its work. This non-UN volunteer organization funded by the United States with volunteer workers and all of that, setting up shop. Hamas is trying to disrupt it, trying to, shoot people who are trying to wait online or trying to create chaos. Then there is chaos, and yet 60 million meals have been distributed. Yes, over the weekend, 2 Americans were injured when hand grenades were thrown at them for the crime of attempting to distribute food in Gaza. So after 20 months of how Israel is starving everybody in Gaza, Israel and the United States have figured out a way to feed the people of Gaza, and it's wildly successful. You're not hearing about that, but suddenly the everybody's starving in Gaza story has quieted down. That's number one. Number two, I want to talk about an astounding piece in the New York Times on Saturday by Michael Shear, reporting out of London, by the way. News analysis, the cost of victory. Israel overpowered its foes, but deepened its isolation. So what is this piece about? This is about how the war started by Hamas on October 7th has flipped entirely from this attack on Israel that left it vulnerable, that made it look like it had lost its deterrence against its enemies, that had broken its spirit, that had broken its heart. I mean, when I wrote my big piece on this after visiting there in November of 2023, I wrote a piece called "A Heartbroken Country." That was what the mood was, and all of this. And now here we are, 20 months later. Israel has defeated Iran. Hezbollah is now negotiating over whether or not to lay down its arms to become a functioning political party inside Lebanon that does not use the risk of violence to dominate or play its role in politics. Hamas is all but neutered. And then the New York Times greets all of these successes with an amazing piece on Saturday by Michael Shear about how Israel's ended up isolating itself on the world stage, while as it has demonstrated that it is now the superpower of the Middle East. It's just so isolated because, it was in such great odor on October 6, 2023. Really people just loved Israel and were so supportive of it all over the place.
Right.
And, and so this is the mindset that is greeting the result of Israel's reassertion of the need for its existence and its willingness to do what it takes to defend the 9 million citizens who live within its borders. Kind of an astonishing fact, and Bibi is coming here to talk to Trump with this as the new reality, which is that Trump can build on Israel's and his successes in Iran to start advancing the international peace process that supposedly Israel is so isolated that it's probably going to make 4 or 5 different Abraham Accords deals in the next year and a half with the countries that supposedly hate it the most.
Well, the countries that hate it the most are in Europe, and the people that hate it the most are in the West.
Well, I think
right?
there's plenty of there's billions of people on this planet that don't like Israel and didn't like Israel before October 6th, right? The most important ones are the ones in Europe and the elites in the United States and all of that, because they have genuine practical power and an effect over the diplomatic things that can be done to Israel.
It is a constant trope that somehow, quote unquote, global opinion is more important than the decisions democracies make. I've encountered this a couple of times over the last week. One, in the spate of global opinion polls showing that foreigners are thinking less of America under Donald Trump. And, how that's supposed to affect American domestic politics, I really don't know. Even though I know that for many liberals and many Democrats, that's the be all and end all, is what other countries, in particular the Western European countries, think about our domestic governance. I also saw this, I'm reading Gene Edward Smith's biography of George W. Bush, which came out about 10 years ago. And while it contains a good factual summary, it's also just a partisan piece of dreck. And again and again and again, he talks about how, there was this moment after 9/11 where the world was just so sympathetic for America. And look at how this crazed religious fanatic, George W. Bush, dealt with it by invading Afghanistan and just ruining all of the goodwill of the United States. And I want to and I do periodically shake the book while I'm reading it, but I want to be shaking Gene and saying, Gene, what did you want us to do? We were not, you had to get to the Al-Qaeda through the Taliban. They weren't giving them up, right? This is the Afghan war, much less the Iraq war, which happened a year later. And yet again and again, it's this idea that if other countries think bad of us, somehow all of our actions are delegitimized.
We should also remember, though, Israel never had such a moment after October 7th. On October 8th, the protesters were already
right. There was
out
no
in the
goodwill
street.
against
Yeah.
exactly, making Michael Shear's thesis even more ridiculous.
I mean, it's almost
but my only point about when I said the people who hated most are in Europe or in the West or whatever, is that it's more important what happens with the countries in the Middle East and Israel. That's the important thing here for Israel, and obviously internally, as Matt says, what happens within the democracy is what matters, but also what it's doing regionally. The changing facts on the ground, as John details here, that matters more than people in far off parliaments denouncing Bibi or the IDF or whatever else.
And it will have longer lasting reverberations. Nothing succeeds like success. And if Israel is seen to have won this 7-front war, which I believe it probably is very close to succeeding in doing, with the Houthis still firing stuff at Israel, going to have to be dealt with by them at some point, it looks like. But the world map, the world's future changes, and you could have encampment people still existing, screaming about how terrible Israel is, and leftist American Jews complaining about the composition of the duly elected Israeli government representing its people and the way that they vote. But the facts on the ground will be the facts on the ground. Israel, approaching its 80th year, will have established itself as a country that this dream of its non-existence will now be seen as a schizophrenic illusion, a schizophrenic delusion. It's not going anywhere ever. And in fact, quite the opposite. If you try to do something to make that happen, you are likely to find yourself in tatters and ruins. So leave it alone. Don't play this game anymore. I think it's a very powerful moment and a powerful message. As we go, because of the conversation we had about disasters, I want to talk. I have a recommendation to make, which I think I may have made a couple of years ago, but I'm just reminded again of this unbelievably prophetic kind of junky novel, semi-junky novel from the 1980s by John MacDonald about a South Florida condominium. The author of the Travis McGee novels wrote a novel called Condominium, which came out in 1977, which is about this poorly built apartment complex in North Miami, and that you meet everybody. It's one of those books, you meet all the 12 characters and they're in different apartments and this and that, blah, blah, blah. And then 300 pages in, there comes a hurricane. And he then describes what happens to this condominium building as the hurricane hits it. And it's this 100 pages of a description of how a building collapses. And how he did it, I don't know. How he saw it, I don't know. But it literally predicted Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And it is an amazing sort of Jules Verne-like feat of predictive fiction. And it's fun to read, like all such books are, and as he is a very fun writer, one of the great mystery novelists of our time. But it is just sort of an amazing thing. So if you can find it, Condominium by John D. MacDonald, you will find yourself, particularly in the wake of what's happened over the weekend, sort of amazed at what an imaginative writer who saw something interesting going on probably in his own apartment building and then sort of extrapolated it into this. It's essentially like the Towering Inferno. It's like a disaster movie of the 70s, but it's about a single building and a neighborhood, which of
The
course
hammers are back, John. The hammers are back.
I do have to add.
All right.
Yeah, the hammering. But can I add, as someone born and raised in Florida, it's not super prescient or super astonishing, since you grow up knowing you're living on like a Swiss cheese of limestone at sea level, and basically sinkholes. These things collapse all the time, because you do understand, I think, in a similar way, if you live in California with earthquakes, that the earth you walk upon is not entirely predictable.
All right, we are having some technical issues here, so John has vanished. So
the construction workers got to him.
Yeah, that's right. The hammering couldn't take it anymore. So this is Abe saying for John, Christine, and Matt, keep the candle burning.